My name is Quinn Mecham. I am an assistant professor of political science here at Middlebury College. I'm also in residence this year as an Academy Scholar at the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. Thank you for your participation this morning. Several familiar faces that I've seen at earlier parts of the symposium as well. Again, this is the final panel of the symposium entitled Islam, Human Rights, and Democracy. Before we get too far into the panel, I do want to reiterate thanks to all of those who have helped sponsor this symposium, including the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs, in whose building we're sitting, the dance program, the Hirschfeld International Film Series, the Middle East Studies program, the Women and Gender Studies program, the Department of Music, Department of Political Science, Department of History, Department of Religion at Middlebury College, and finally Brainerd Commons, all of whom have been very helpful as we have organized this and have chipped in with their time and resources to make this happen so well. There has been a slight change in the panel this morning. I want to call your attention to, in your program, Amr Hamzawy from the Carnegie Endowment unfortunately has to send his regrets due to some personal issues that came up this week. But we do have our other two panelists, and we have added an additional panelist as well. I think what I will do is introduce all the panelists right up front, and then I won't have to do that before they begin their remarks. Our first speaker today will be Modirzadeh. And you have bios as you came in, but let me just highlight a couple of things about Naz's background. She's a senior associate at the Harvard Program on Humanitarian Policy and Conflict Research, where she oversees the program's work on international humanitarian law and the Middle East. She's previously worked for Human Rights Watch, later served as an assistant professor and director of the International Human Rights Law Master's Program at the American University in Cairo. She's carried out field research and professional training in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and in Europe, published and lectured on human rights and torture, the application of international humanitarian law in Iraq and Palestine, Islamic law and human rights, and legal reform and Islamic law in Afghanistan. Our second speaker today will be Mirjam Künkler. Mirjam Künkler is a political scientist who recently joined the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. And Mirjam's research focuses on processes of regime transformation, specifically in Iran and in Indonesia, and on how social movements and regime opposition relations bear on the erosion or stabilization of political power in those countries. In her recent research, she has looked at the impact of contemporary political thought and social movement activism on the transformation of authoritarian rule in Iran and also in Indonesia in the 1990s. So we're very pleased to have them with us today. Our discussant, again, some of you have had a chance to see him on our first panel. I think he'll be a nice fitting conclusion to tie our first panel in with our final panel, Anas Malik, who is an assistant professor of political science at Xavier University in Cincinnati, who does research specifically on political Islam and development. He grew up in Pakistan and Libya, and actually was very excited, I learned, to come to Vermont from Cincinnati because he went to school down the road in Marlborough College not too long ago, probably, right? Anas. He's also been very involved in dialogues within the Islamic Society of North America, and he is a great person from my perspective to have on this panel because he is able to take some of the normative commitments and understanding of Islam, look at them also through a social science lens, and build a bridge for us between our first and final panels today. Now, before I turn the time over to our panelists, I'm actually going to take a few minutes to reflect briefly on the symposium to this point and provide a little bit of context for the remarks that you're going to hear this morning. I think that the symposium has addressed a number of key issues so far. First, we better understand, those of us that have been in attendance, what Islam means to individuals within the tradition. We understand better that it's not just about politics, but it's about faith, It's about discipline. It's about practice. It's about submission of one's will within the will of God, and finding yourself, in some respects, by losing your own desires and replacing them with godly desires. We've learned that it's about purity of heart as coupled with purity of action and behavior for those who practice it. In his earlier comments in the symposium, James Piscatori also highlighted, I think, the importance in understanding how Islam intersects with politics by talking about the fragmentation of Islamic authority, which creates rich avenues for Islam to become politicized, making the argument that politics uses a rich array of Islamic symbols and ways of understanding the world to mobilize individuals for political purposes. That when we try to understand Islam and politics, we have to recognize that understanding Islamist protest or violence or success at the polls is first, in some ways, about politics and not about religion. Religion certainly does matter, but it matters in creating the symbolic meanings that can be leveraged to pursue individual political goals. Now, we've been reminded by others, Andrew March among them, that Islam is also a moral and philosophical system. It has its own internal life that is difficult to discount when explaining political behavior. Religion, as religion, does matter, right? Personal commitment does matter, and an outsider's ability to effectively critique what matters internally is necessarily limited. We've looked as well, to some extent, at the case of Iraq. Both the fragmentation and the sectarianism that has emerged, how that will impact the future of political Islam, and how Islamic institutions have been able to create order in that context when order was gone after the American invasion. David Patel has helped us understand how regular channels of Islamic communication, such as the Friday sermon or at community mosques, can help empower people to create order and to coordinate activity in the absence of effective coordination by the state. In contrasting the political success of the Iraqi Shia community with its hierarchical clergy and well-organized religious institutions with the more fragmented political response of the Iraqi Sunnis, I think we now better understand the important role that Islamic institutions play in building common knowledge, political expectations, and the ability of people to act collectively on their political preferences. This brings us to the panel this morning, which will more explicitly address two issues that very often come up in discussions of Islam and politics, in particular the issues of human rights and democracy. In my experience, human rights often comes up in parallel with the discussion around Islamic law, which specifies particular duties and obligations of Muslims in a social context, and is sometimes considered at odds with universal human rights as they are conceived by a variety of rights advocates. Likewise, there has been a long debate on the compatibility between Islam and democracy, which to some extent continues in Islamic and democratic political thought. As was mentioned briefly in the symposium previously, that debate is perhaps less relevant in the real world, where the majority of Muslims actually do live under some form of democracy, even if it is at times imperfect. But several debates on Islam and democracy are alive and raging, and these include what happens when Islamists form political parties and participate in elections? What happens to them? How do they change? Does it change the movements? Does it change the parties themselves? Does it change the systems in which they operate? Another debate centers around the forms that democracy can take that are compatible with Islamic law and aligned with Islamic conceptions of pluralism. If we take Islamic law seriously and we think about what pluralism means, in that context, how does that specifically relate to the forms of democracy that we see in Muslim societies? Finally, what's the role of non-Muslim minorities within an Islamic state or within an Islamic democracy? Again, this is a debate that continues in the circles, both empirically and philosophically, when we talk about Islam and democracy. Let me just conclude, before I introduce the titles of our panelists' remarks, with a personal observation, which is that I was reflecting this summer about a trip I made in 2002. I lived and taught in Ankara, Turkey during that year, in which time I looked specifically at the Islamist movement in Turkey. The Islamist movement in Turkey has a long and rich history. It has largely expressed itself in competitive elections in a series of political parties that have formed and emerged and have been banned and then re-emerged under different names with different leadership over time. And in 2002 in Turkey, a remarkable thing was happening within the movement. It had been splitting between an older generation that in some ways was more conservative and a younger generation that saw a unique opportunity to participate in democratic politics and make a case that, in fact, they were plausibly the best possible organization to lead Turkey in the new millennium, which was a striking claim, partly because Turkey had a rich secularist history. Ataturk, one of the founders of modern Turkey, was pretty shy about his Islamic affiliations. He wanted to emulate Europe in many respects. And Turkey had long prided itself, particularly in elite circles, on its ability to remain secular with a very secular constitution as a Muslim country within Europe. Within the last number of years, this movement has done remarkably well in Turkish politics, which is interesting partly because it's done remarkably well, but also partly because it has also very much transformed how the Islamist movement has expressed itself in Turkey. In many ways, the Justice and Development Party, which just won a resounding election again a couple of months ago in Turkey for the second time, has transformed itself from a traditional Islamic institution into a Muslim political party that has Islamic roots, but yet sees itself much more in a populist tradition, and one that caters to Muslim interests while remaining very committed to a democratic system. Now, we've seen similar kinds of transformations, perhaps not quite to the same extent, in countries such as Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood has been very committed in recent years, despite a lot of state opposition, to running in elections, in the Justice and Development Party in Morocco, among a number of others. So we're in an interesting era to think about how Islamic movements interact in democracy, how they do in fact evolve, and what the consequences are, both for democracy, for Islam, and for the world. Our first speaker, again, is Modirzadeh. She will be speaking on encountering Islamic law, human rights practitioners, and democratization in the Muslim world. Following Modirzadeh's comments, we will hear from Mirjam Künkler on Muslim-majority societies and democratic state-religion relations. Naz.
Thank you very much, Quinn, and I wanted to thank you so much for organizing this very fascinating symposium, and to, again, note my regret for missing the keynote on the first night. I think probably would have been illuminating for some of the comments we're talking about today. This is my second time at Middlebury this year, and I have to admit, as someone who was raised on the West Coast, I think Middlebury is my sort of ideal, typical East Coast town, and now to see the autumn season coming in, it's a wonderful place to be. And so I'm happy to be here today. I wanted to talk, I'm not going to be talking very much about democracy, so I'll say that at the beginning, but I'll be talking about the context in which human rights activists, human rights advocates, and human rights lawyers find themselves working in the contemporary situation in the Muslim world, and particularly in the Middle East. So in a context in which at least the United States, if not a number of other Western states, have explicitly stated their intent to democratize the Middle East and to bring democratic institutions and international human rights through a variety of means, whether through military means or through massive international aid to countries in the region, or through NGO exchanges and other contacts with communities in the Middle East. In that context, how do we think about human rights, and how do we think about human rights work in the Muslim world? So that's the sort of general frame of what I'll be talking about. I wanted to sort of, in hopefully 3 moderately organized parts, talk about this issue. One is I just wanted to frame my own approach to this dilemma and to talk about the context of how I see current human rights work encountering Islamic law. 2, I wanted to talk about how I see some of the costs of this current approach. What basically is wrong with the way we are currently dealing with Islamic law on the part of the human rights movement, and why I think it's important to focus on law as opposed to other aspects of Islam or culture that we might consider equally important in human rights compliance. And finally, I wanted to sort of use an example to talk about some of the ways forward out of this dilemma as I currently see it. So I wanted to just position myself vis-a-vis all of this. I came at this question, I think, very much out of frustration. I was at a number of conferences and academic exchanges and roundtables where I found that Middle Eastern leaders, Islamic legal thinkers were brought to some wonderful university in the West, and the debate would be Islam and human rights. Is there a conflict? And inevitably, the Muslim speaker would be called upon to talk about the fact that, of course, there is no conflict. Islam is a religion of peace. Human rights are universal. Everyone would nod their heads and say, yes, of course, that's true. And then the human rights speaker would inevitably say, of course, there is no inherent conflict with Islam. Everybody wants human rights, and everyone would nod their heads. And that was sort of the way of dealing with or dismissing the dilemma of the relationship between human rights and Islam. Parallel to that, I found in the region that there were a number of very specific conflicts and debates that were being fought and hashed out that had not to do with Islam and human rights as broad, for me, an indefinable context ultimately, but they were about specific legal battles that were taking place in specific places and affecting specific communities. And so my sense was that the human rights movement did not have a theory about how to engage Islamic law and a satisfying intellectual way of explaining how it encounters Islamic law. So that's how I came to this issue. So I should note at the outset that I believe that there is a conflict between international human rights law and Islamic law as currently practiced in states in the region. I also think that doesn't need to be a very big deal. So I think that human rights law conflicts with all kinds of laws around the world, and that the human rights movement has developed a series of methods for dealing with that conflict that have been satisfactory, strategically useful, and theoretically sound in a number of contexts. I think that when it comes to Islamic law, we're currently underthinking the ways in which we might engage. So first, let me talk about how I see the human rights movement currently approaching Islamic law, and then we can talk about whether or not that's problematic. I think to frame the dilemma in terms of 2007, we have a context in which the Bush administration and a number of other leading American think tanks and organizations have stated their intent to engage in the Middle East, not only in democratization efforts, but in a program of bringing greater human rights respect to the region. So we've seen hundreds of millions of dollars channeled through the Middle East Partnership Initiative, other State Department and various think tank organizations to foster greater respect for human rights in the region. I think that for a number of human rights activists, this is a deeply problematic situation to be working in. If you're a human rights advocate that wants to convince others in the region, in the Middle East region, that they too should be advocating for human rights, I think it's a very difficult time to be doing that today. Many activists are doing that in the context of people in the Middle East who think that it's quite possible that talk of human rights will quickly be followed by bombs and tanks. And I think in that context, the challenge of how to think about advocacy in the Middle East has become even more urgent. So the traditional approach to Islamic legal dilemmas, and I'll get into a technical example in a moment so we can work through that as a more tangible way of thinking about Islamic law. The traditional approach to dealing with problems of Islamic law is to first say, we, the human rights activists, are not talking about Islamic law. So if we look at, for example, the problem or the issue of stoning, clearly the punishment of stoning for a crime, let's say a crime of consensual sex, zina. So let's say the crime of extramarital sex by two consenting adults. There are a number of countries in which, through Islamic legal justifications, this is criminalized, and one of the possible punishments upon conviction is stoning to death. Well, that certainly seems to contradict human rights principles. So the first move that's often made by human rights advocates is to say, this is not a question of Islamic law. We do not deal with problems of religion. We only deal with human rights. So this contradicts human rights. And because we are neutral human rights advocates, we will only assess this dilemma, that of stoning people for engaging in consensual sexual behavior, on the grounds of whether or not it complies with international human rights law. There will be a section, usually in a report on human rights or in an advocacy session, which will say that there's testimony about the horrific nature of this punishment, and oftentimes will point out the lack of due process in the ultimate conviction for zina and the punishment of stoning. And ultimately, I have found that a number of human rights reports, a number of advocacy methodologies used by the human rights community end by saying, well, we have determined that these laws are all contradictory to human rights law, and so therefore state X should, Saudi Arabia, let's say, should immediately abolish all laws that contradict human rights law. Now, this is coming into a context in which the laws behind the criminalization of consensual sexual behavior and the punishment of stoning are rooted in, as we know, an alternative legal system. So unlike, let's say, torture of political dissidents in a number of countries in the world, the punishment of stoning for extramarital sexual behavior is in fact rooted in an Islamic legal doctrine that has a rich history, that has its own tradition of interpretation, and that is thought by many to be central to some of the core crimes defined by the Quran and by central texts, revealed texts in Islamic law. I would argue that the current position of the human rights movement in asserting that it has nothing to do with religion and that indeed it has no place to engage religious law, but rather that it only talks about dilemmas in the context of their violating human rights, avoids an incredibly important opportunity for engagement with the Islamic world and with Islamic legal theorists on those areas that I argue conflict directly with human rights law. Now, I should say that I don't think that that conflict is unique to Islam by any means, and nor do I think that we ought to assume that because there is a conflict, that means that one or the other legal doctrine is inherently superior. But I think that the current system leaves that we are able to avoid dealing with some of the difficult legal dilemmas and instead find ourselves dealing with what seem like cultural dilemmas. So we often find that when we discuss issues like stoning or like zina, that we are talking about whether or not Muslims can accept human rights or whether or not Islam could possibly be compatible with human rights. I would argue that the human rights movement must identify those aspects of Islamic law that are doctrinally contradictory to parallel legal norms in the human rights system. And that in doing that, we may find that there are areas that can be engaged without dealing with many of these broader cultural dilemmas that we find ourselves rightly concerned about. I should say that I'm leaving out a number of very important and very, I would say, popular contemporary arguments about this issue. So one is that Islam is internally plural and contested. Yes, I think that's true. But I think that we have to recognize that the fact that there may be a brilliant scholar from Pakistan or Yemen who writes a book arguing that Islamic law, in fact, provides the grounds for progressive, radical reform of women's rights and other areas of law, that is not the same thing as Islamic law as currently applied by states in the region. And so I think while absolutely we ought to recognize that all contemporary legal regimes are internally contested, have multiple authorities, multiple sites of action, we also must understand that just like other areas of law that we understand as enshrined in institutions and promulgated through authority, Islamic law, too, currently has sites of application and figures of authority. Two, I am leaving out the argument here that the Islam that we see being promulgated by authorities in the contemporary world, so for example, those who would carry out stoning sentences, is not the real Islam. So many of you may have heard this argument that in fact anything that we see that is bad couldn't possibly be real Islam. It has to be the wrong Islam or an instrumental use of Islam or an attempt by powerful leaders to use Islam to get the ends that they want. I don't know if that's true. I don't know how we should define the real Islam as opposed to the fake Islam. But again, I think that we ought to consider that there are laws that are affecting real Muslims in real countries, and that whether or not they ultimately symbolize or project the true spirit of Islam today is less of a question at the state legal level than is the question of what are the laws that are currently being presented as based on Islamic legal doctrine. And 3, I'm leaving out the argument that all Islamic laws can simply be done away with by noting that they are contravening human rights law and that they can be reformed. We tend to use the word reform a little too liberally, I think, when we talk about Islamic law. Islamic law, just like our own legal system in this country and in many other countries, is complicated. There's a process by which reform happens. There are authority figures that are more or less powerful than other authority figures. And so I think we need to recognize that if we are going to call upon states to do away with all laws that contradict human rights, we have to understand that that will require a process of engagement and difficult doctrinal transformation that cannot be initiated simply by saying Islam must go through a process of reform. So I'll just bring my third part to a close here in talking about what I think some of the costs are and what some of the ways are that we could move forward, that the human rights movement could move forward on this dilemma. I think that the way that we are currently engaging Islamic law, one, it creates a sense that the dilemma between Islam and human rights is one that permeates Islam. So there's this sense that the entire Muslim world is this sort of vaguely anti-human rights zone, that you walk around and you just run into violations left and right. It doesn't give us a concrete understanding of what it is in Islamic law that contradicts human rights. 2, I think that it shifts a lot of the hard work of reforming Islamic law to local activists in specific contexts. So when the human rights movement says, all of these laws violate human rights and you should immediately do away with them, without talking about their legal tradition, their interpretive mechanisms, and what traditions they're rooted in, we tend to shift all of that work to the people in countries like Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Iran that have the job of actually changing these laws in many cases. And 3, I would say that we leave the authority to interpret Islam to traditional existing orthodoxies. So in saying we are a human rights organization, we are Western, we are whatever, and that doesn't give us the space or the authority to engage Islamic law, I could say I am a woman, and so therefore that doesn't give me the authority traditionally to engage Islamic law. I think by doing that, we leave Islamic law in the hands of the individuals who have controlled Islamic law for the last 1,400 years. Now, that may be fine. They may be very good at engaging Islamic law. But it also means that we do not open up possible avenues of engagement, transformation, and again, the very difficult work of changing doctrines on both sides. I'm not assuming, by the way, that human rights law would stay exactly as it is and Islam would change. The change might go both ways. I'm also not advocating, by the way, that we should engage in, quote, conversations. I think conversations are also very popular these days, that we should all engage in conversations with each other. I'm actually suggesting that we need to look at the doctrinal conflict and determine innovative ways in which they might be changed. So finally, I'll end by saying that I think we see a number of ways in which this could move forward, that we could change the current way of dealing with human rights and Islamic law and the engagement between the two. One is to ultimately say very clearly, actually, the human rights movement believes that authenticity matters, that there are people that just have no place talking about Islamic law. So we're not going to talk about it anymore. If that is the answer, then I would suggest that the human rights movement ought not engage topics that are in fact areas of Islamic law. They should leave that to people that have more expertise and more authenticity to talk about those dilemmas. 2 would be to say, actually, we've looked at Islamic law and it absolutely contradicts human rights, and so we're going to openly challenge it. We have a secularizing mission. We are going to approach Islamic law wherever we find it and demand that it be extricated from state legal norms. Finally, I would argue, and perhaps the most hopeful possibility in moving out of the current dilemma, is to develop innovative approaches to Islamic law. To accept that human rights, by its very nature, assumes that people in one part of the world have some capacity to talk about and talk with dilemmas of people in other parts of the world. And if we accept that as a premise, problematic as it may be, then that means we ought to equally be able to engage Islamic law as much as we engage the law of the state of Argentina or the laws of a state within the United States. So I will just close by saying I think that these are, hopefully we're going to talk about some of these dilemmas also in the context of democratization and democracy, but I think that these are many questions that are currently being debated, and I think some of the talks that we've had here in these 2 days are really helping to move the field forward and to have a better understanding of these dilemmas. Thank you.
Thank you. I was planning to walk around a little bit, but I'll stick to the microphone for the time being, and maybe I'll try to walk around later on and see whether you can all hear me. Thank you very much, Quinn, and Middlebury College more generally for having invited me to take part in this exciting symposium. My task is here to speak about democracy and Islam more generally, and what I will do is I'll give a brief overview over where I think political science and the social sciences, and also to some extent the humanities, have led us in the last 5 to 10 years in thinking about the relationship between Islam and democracy more generally. Then more specifically in what social sciences have taught us about the role that religious movements and religious authorities can play in democratization processes. And this includes also non-Muslim religious movements. The research encompasses Christian and Hindu, Buddhist, Islamic authorities and movements, and what kind of role they potentially, whether it is supportive or rather a destructive role they can play in democratization processes. And I will close with some observations on what I think are really the challenges ahead in the democratization of the Muslim world with regard to religion-state relations. And I think that that is an important topic of the future, this assumption that liberal democracy is somehow reliant on a strict separation between church and state or between religion and state is erroneous in my point of view and conceptually misleading. And I will talk about how I think actually new models of religion-state relations institutionally are being developed in the few Muslim democracies that have emerged in the last 17 years. So just to give an overview, Quinn mentioned it in the beginning already, that we have sort of moved beyond the discussion of whether there is an inherent tension between Islam and democracy, because the empirical reality is that the majority of Muslims worldwide do live in democracies. And just to give you some numbers, it's sometimes helpful to keep these in mind. Of course, we have very large Muslim minorities living in long-standing democracies, both in Western Europe, the United States, and India. These amount to, the largest Muslim minority is in India, 175 million. Then you have in France and the United States 4 to 5 million, in Germany 3 million, in the Netherlands and Denmark substantial minorities. These Muslim minorities have lived in long-standing democracies for decades, and obviously at the individual level, there's no tension that is perceived here between democratic citizenship, practicing democratic citizenship on the one hand, and fulfilling one's religious duties as a Muslim believer on the other. Then we find, if we look at those countries that have Muslim majorities, we find since the early 90s a number of countries that have democratized. Mostly in the non-Arab Muslim world, starting with Senegal in 1990, Mali in 1992, Indonesia in 1998, Albania. You can include Turkey. I would, at least since 2001. It always depends, of course, what kind of indicators and definitions of democracy you apply. But even if you are quite strict and reject minimalist notions of democracy that look at only electoralism, but also insist that political rights, civil liberties have to be in place, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, of course, freedom of religion, that actually those that are elected into the legislative councils have to arrive at decision-making processes without substantive veto actors, then boycotting that process, such as the military or religious authorities. If you accept a notion of democracy that is a little bit more encompassing than electoral democracies, then you find at least 5 or 6 countries in the Muslim world in the majority Muslim world that have democratized in the last 17 years. And just to reiterate again and mention them again, Senegal, Mali, Indonesia, Turkey, you can include Bangladesh, although that country is undergoing a crisis at the moment. The military has overtaken power again since January this year, but nevertheless it has a substantive democratic history, that country. And of course you can also include Albania, which is nominally Muslim. Questions arise as to what extent religious practices are widespread there after the demise of communism. The country was quite successfully deconfessionalized, you might say, just as many other Eastern European countries were de-Christianized over time. But it is a nominally Muslim country, and so we have at least 5 to 6 Muslim majority states today that have embraced democratic politics and nevertheless have also arrived, as I will argue later on, at particular institutional constellations that actually do allow for an accommodation of religion in the public sphere that goes beyond the strict separation model that we know from the United States. If you add up these populations, the Muslim minorities in the non-majoritarian Muslim world, about 190 million, and then those Muslims that live in these newly established Muslim majority democracies, about 420 million, you arrive at a number of 610 million or so of Muslims that empirically do live under democratic conditions. And so it is empirically misleading and or empirically wrong and conceptually misleading to, in that context, to still argue about sort of inherent tension between, on the individual level, democratic citizenship and practices of religious duty. I will talk now a little bit about the research that has been undertaken on the role of religious movements and religious authorities in democratization processes. And this is relatively new research. Perhaps one of the most important and comprehensive studies has been undertaken at the Harvard Institute for Area and International Studies, a project called Religion and Global Politics that looked at democratic transitions between 1971 and 2000, identifying 87 transitions and finding that in about a third, religious movements and religious authorities had a positive impact to play on the democratization process. So neither neutral nor hindering effect, but a supportive and often quite substantive input on the democratization process itself. Now, you might wonder what are the factors that determine whether religious organizations and religious authorities will behave in supportive ways during such processes. And I think one often looks at this question intuitively, starting from religious dogma, and you would say, well, if we look at the religious beliefs that are prevalent in this particular society and that form the scholarly consensus on how religion is being disseminated and preached, you would assume that that a religion that perhaps first of all embraces interfaith values, gender egalitarianism, perhaps a healthy criticism towards authority, and more ideas of the empowerment of individual judgment would be more conducive towards playing a positive role in democratization processes. Well, this research project found that religious dogma really doesn't have there's no significant correlation between religious dogma and the role that religious movements do play in these processes. Secondly, you might also expect that the internal organization of the religion matters, right? So a long-standing argument about the Catholic Church in the time of Latin American dictatorships was, well, you know, the Catholic Church, with its belief in hierarchies and this respect for religious authority that is being instilled, translates into also respect for political authority and sort of the not inability, but the hesitation to challenge both religious and political power. So one might assume that the internal organization of a religion matters, not only with regard to how hierarchically it is structured, but perhaps also with regard to how internal decisions are actually arrived at, whether there are mechanisms that bring believers together and democratically administer their parishes, for example, or on the scholarly level, whether their consensus plays a large part, or whether that it is rather a hierarchical way of imposing particular religious views. Well, this also apparently didn't matter. The internal organization of religious movements and organizations didn't have an impact on the role that they would play in political transformation processes. What did matter, by contrast, is, first of all, the legal standing vis-à-vis the political regime. So the more legal autonomy a religious organization would have vis-à-vis the state, the more likely it would be able to offer its spaces as a platform for you could say, deliberations about alternative political ideologies. Perhaps it could even, through its infrastructure, serve as a mobilizational power that would bring people into the streets. And of course, this is only possible if there is some realm of legal autonomy that can be retained vis-à-vis the state. To give you an example that both from the Christian and one from the Muslim world, from East Germany first and then one from Indonesia, East Germany, the churches in East Germany had a very, very peculiar legal status that was unique and differed from all the churches in the other Eastern European countries, and that the Soviet Union granted the East German Church in 1953 complete legal autonomy. The hiring practices, how dues would be collected, how religious debates would take place. This was all within the realm of legal autonomy that was granted towards the churches. And even though the communist regime was very, very successful in de-Christianizing East German society, if you look at levels today, about 80% of the West Germans will say that they feel affiliated to a particular religion. In East Germany, it's only 20%. So within 40 years, you find that these very, very substantive differences in terms of how people affiliate to a particular religion. Nevertheless, in the downfall of the Berlin Wall, it was the East German churches that played really the dominant part in mobilizing people for the Monday demonstrations, in organizing the protests and demonstrations that in the end led to the storming of the National Security Council that sort of became the symbol of the end of the GDR. And this was possible because the spaces of the churches could be used for dissidents to come together to exchange ideas of a possible post-communist order. And also, the internal communication devices could be used. As soon as the church would actually have a stamp, as soon as it would say for internal consumption only, the Stasi, the Staatssicherheit, the National Security Council, did not have a National Security Service, did not have any right to intersect that communication. And this is how it could be disseminated between parishes. So this is just a nice example, I think, of how this legal autonomy can really facilitate the use of spaces that are provided by religious organizations, even if religious dogma doesn't play a large role. And indeed, in East Germany, as we see also today, with very low levels of attendance and expressed affiliation to religion, it is not the normative power of the churches that brought people into organizing here vis-à-vis the political regime. It's not the religious power, but it was the legal space that sort of provided some isolation for dissidents and opposition and contestation here. An example from Indonesia is there's large Islamic organizations. Indonesia is unique in that about 60 million of the inhabitants, Indonesia has 210 million inhabitants, about 200 million of those are Muslim. 60 million are organized in the large Islamic organizations, which also both throughout the authoritarian period, Indonesia democratized in 1998, retained legal autonomy to a large extent. There was some meddling by the regime vis-à-vis deciding who would be the chairpersons of these religious organizations, but after all, usually the councils would prevail and would be able to put in place someone of their own choosing rather than someone that was politically in tune with the regime. And it is indeed the Islamic organizations in Indonesia that did bring out the large student protests in 97, 99 that did bring down Suharto in the end. So both in terms of mobilizing its believers because of the infrastructure that these Islamic organizations have in hand. This is reminiscent a little bit of what David talked about yesterday in terms of the infrastructure that the Al-Sistani network actually can use in order to disseminate political ideas. Something similar happened in Indonesia, whereby it's not so much the case that particular sermons would be disseminated and thereby sort of very clear political messages would be sent, but rather that you would have small religious discussion groups that would talk about the nature of the state that is neither religious nor secular. It's based on an ideology called Panchasila, which is a very sort of useful ideology to insist that Indonesia is a religious state, but one that accommodates all religions. It has very substantive Hindu, Buddhist, and Christian minorities. So in disseminating these ideas and also, as I mentioned before, in mobilizing believers for the demonstrations that did bring down the authoritarian regime in the late 90s. These are just two examples of how legal autonomy can work very effectively for religious organizations, even if dogma doesn't play that much of a role. Also, financial autonomy is another matter that was found to be of significance, particularly if religious organizations can rely on transnational finances and do not depend on national, and particularly, of course, on state finances. They can use these finances to facilitate organizations that challenge political power. To move on to the question of religion-state relations. Now, we often assume, and I think unfortunately that viewpoint is still quite dominant, that a liberal democracy relies on the strict separation between church and state. Now, there's a very useful data set. Jonathan Fox from Bar-Ilan University in Israel has actually coded 198 societies according to their constitutions and their legislation of religion-state relationships. So this concerns only institutional relations. He looked at to what extent are particular religions regulated. The majority religion is regulated. Are the minority religions regulated? What are the how much of religious reference enters legislation in terms of dietary laws, interfaith marriages, hiring practices? What are levels of discrimination against religious minorities? He coded, I don't know, I think he has 80 variables or so. He coded these 198 societies along these 80 variables of indicators about religion-state relations in these societies based on the constitution and national legislation. And he found that, not so surprisingly perhaps, it is only the United States that has a strict institutional separation between religion and state. He found that it's not unique in the constitutional provisions. There are about 20 other countries, 20 other democracies that insist on a strict separation, but it is in the United States that this separation is most strictly interpreted by the U.S. court system. And so on the basis of the Disestablishment Clause, this principle is most strictly upheld in the United States. So the United States is the only one that receives actually a 0 in this data set in terms of regulation of religion with regard, in comparison to all other 197 countries coded here. So if you look at most India, but also most West European democracies, you find very, very sometimes tight channels of venues of cooperation between religion and state. A lot of, I think actually, still all of the European member countries, I'm not sure about the 10 newly acceded ones, but the Europe of the 15, in every single European membership country, you would have religious instruction in public school. Or you would have state funding of private religious schools. So even in France, that we often think of as an example of strict laïcité, about a fifth of the national education budget goes to Catholic schools, to private Catholic schools. In the Netherlands, 50% of the educational budget for both secondary and primary and secondary education goes towards religious schools. So that's just one example. Another example is that in Germany, for example, even the tertiary education, the theological faculties are funded by the state. It's not the churches, and we actually also have professors in Muslim theology, of course. These are not funded by the churches or the Muslim community. These are funded by the state. It's a state that hires professors of theology. The state does that in cooperation with representatives of the religious communities, but they don't have veto power. And as an example, as a consequence of that, you have people like Eugen Drewermann, who was excommunicated by the Catholic Church because of his critique of the papacy. and still could retain his professorship in a Catholic faculty of theology. So that is quite remarkable. And whether you think of this as a positive or a negative development, clearly the state here, in my interpretation, facilitates the pluralism of theological discourse in not allowing the church to dominate only those that represent actually the religious dogma. So I personally think that there's something positive in these close venues or channels of cooperation. You find other examples that church or religious taxes are collected in Finland, in Germany, in Spain, in Finland, Germany, Spain, Italy, which means actually that the religious communities pay the state to allow them to use the financial infrastructure of the state to collect its levies. So it's not the case that these are actually taxes that are collected by the state, but they are collected through the state financial system to then be rechanneled to the religious communities, and they do pay an administrative fee for using that system. But nevertheless, it's still more effective or efficient for them to do that than collect their membership levies on the local level. So why do I go into these examples of tight religion-state relations? Well, because I think, and if you look at these 5-6 countries, Muslim-majority countries that have emerged since 1990, none of those has models of a strict religion-state separation. And some of the reason, of course, is what Naz was hinting at earlier, that Islamic law, of course, does play a large role, and there's always this contestation that is going on about how much the state has to facilitate an environment in which religious practice can take place. I will just give you 2 examples from Senegal and from Indonesia, where I think this cooperation and this formulation of new religion-state models has been quite beneficial. From Indonesia, what you find is that since the early 1990s, the state has cooperated with religious leaders and administrators of madrasas to reform the religious curriculum. And so the state has committed itself to open state Islamic universities that will actually accept madrasa graduates into the university system. This is significant because the secular state universities would not allow madrasa graduates without extra qualification exams to enter into that university system. So since the early 90s, the state developed the system of state Islamic universities that are specifically open to graduates of madrasas, but at the same time asked madrasas to have a say in the religious curriculum and in the expansion of the natural sciences, the social sciences, and vocational trainings that are part also of the curriculum within the madrasas. And so what has taken place is that about 13% of all pupils in Indonesia go to madrasas. About 5 million of, I think, 44 million or so that are students more generally. So what has happened is that today you find, first of all, interpretations of the religious sources that, certainly from an Arab point of view, would strike you as very, very progressive and perhaps sometimes even quite unorthodox. You have women who lead madrasas, who lead religious schools. Of course, these are mostly women from charismatic families whose fathers must have or were influential ulama, and who then have sort of taken on this charisma and are accepted in the community because of their family background, but not only because of that. Of course, also they have emerged as influential, charismatic female preachers themselves. And if you look at Java, it's unique in comparison to the larger Muslim world that about 1/5 of all preachers are actually women. That is unthinkable in many other Muslim-majority societies. So women have started to play a large role in madrasa education, and you do find madrasas that are now led by women. You have co-educational instruction in many madrasas now. You have new textbooks that look more specifically at interfaith relations. And one thing that's also interesting, this idea that the Constitution of Medina, the conception of the Ummah in the Constitution of Medina included non-Muslims, and that therefore also the conception of the Ummah in Indonesia should include non-Muslims. And this is expanded beyond the Jews and the Christians, of course, to the Hindu and Buddhist communities that are substantive minorities within the country. This has all taken place as part of the cooperation program with the state. And from the European perspective, particularly after World War II, you would often actually find in the public debate this argument that the state has to civilize religion. Particularly in Germany, after the failure of the churches in the Nazi regime, the idea was quite prevalent that you would have to really try to bring in line religious dogma and religious practices with democratic and liberal ideas. And this is a slow process that took place over 20, 30 years. If you read the arguments of religious leaders in the 50s and the late 40s in Germany, it's quite striking how anti-democratic and illiberal many of them were, thinking that a party system could never be accepted for a Protestant. And they go back to publications of Luther to argue why that is something that cannot be accepted from a Protestant point of view. So it's just I think, a nice way to remember that it is very open political processes, I think, that do impact the formation of religious dogma. And I think what is taking place here, as an example in Indonesia, is also this idea of whether you normatively want to support it or not, but what is taking place is that this idea of a civilization of religion and actually really bringing it in line with democratic practices. So particularly this idea of interfaith relationships on which Indonesia is built, that is very important, has been disseminated through this cooperation program with the schools. Just to end with an example from health issues in Senegal. The Senegal is striking in that both in terms of female genital mutilation and AIDS rates, it is the lowest in Western Africa. And particularly if you look at female genital mutilation, the rate in Senegal is, according to UNICEF figures, 28%. In all of the neighboring states, it's between 85 and 96%. Research that has looked at the cause for this very, very strong divergence in the rates has found that the Sufi orders, that are sort of very important normative sources within Senegalese society, have, in cooperation with the state, embarked since 1992 on a public health program that really looks at the religious sources and first of all, of course, informs and educates believers about the consequences of female genital mutilation, and then looks at the religious sources to say, well, there's no justification for that in our traditions and in our religious traditions, and therefore we shouldn't practice it. With regard to AIDS, something similar is taking place, the argument that condoms should be used, of course, most importantly that extramarital sex is not is something that one should refrain from. This is also found to be important both in the religious schools, but also in the small circles of religious study and Friday prayers, where these arguments have been made and disseminated through the Sufi orders. So here again, this cooperation between religious leaders and the state has been important in bringing about a change in both religious practices and at some point then also, I think, religious dogma. So to close, I just want to perhaps end with the observation that I think it is useful to problematize this idea of liberal democracy being based on a strict separation between religion and state, because empirically it's obviously misleading that the majority of democracies do not exercise or entertain a strict separation between religion and state, and also I think normatively one wonders whether that is the best solution, certainly for Muslim majority societies, but even for many Christian majority societies in Western Europe. And I think that one can look at two reasons. The one is that strategically, of course, a lot of religious leaders, I think, will cooperate in transition and democratization processes if they know that a post-authoritarian democratic order will not mean their entire marginalization into the private sphere. So if they know that they can actually they have a role to play in shaping the public sphere, public discourse, public practices in a post-authoritarian democratic regime, they might, of course, be more likely to cooperate also with secular movements within these authoritarian societies. But the more, and so for reasons of inclusiveness, this might be important. But the more important, I think, normative reasons are that I think the one idea to bring religious beliefs and practices in line with democratic values and politics in order to, to really provide the normative basis in society for the support for liberal democratic values, but also, and this is an argument that you won't hear here, I think, very often, but that is now more prevalent in Central Europe, the skepticism towards the ability of liberal democracy to actually provide the normative basis from which it nourishes itself. So the idea is that civil society has a strong role to play in providing this normative basis, and a cooperation between religious and political authorities can aid the creation of this normative basis, whereas a liberal democracy that is based on the strict separation between religion and state cannot. So I will close with these.
Panelists with, is that better? Okay, thank you. I was just expressing my gratitude to Quinn and to the symposium and to Middlebury College. It is wonderful to be back here in Vermont, and it was wonderful to have these 2 days of interaction with my fellow panelists, with the great student body, the wonderful collection of international students especially, and the various others that we've interacted with and been hosted by. Thank you very much. Now, I have the interesting task of looking at 5 incredible presentations and 15 minutes to do that, and to explain a little bit about my own background and where I'm coming from on this matter. Obviously, for those of you who were here in the first panel, you know that part of my interest is in terms of my normative commitment to Islam as a practicing, attempting Muslim, and in terms of my own research, the areas that I'm interested in have to do with the intersection of ideas, of strategies, of opportunities and institutions. And the lens through which I've been looking at it through most recently in my current major project is the idea that political survival as a goal for leaders of Islamist social movement organizations tends to overwhelm other ideological affinities with which they're often painted by the literature, including, it seems to me, some of the social movements literature. So that's been one approach that I've been looking at. I'm particularly interested in things like choices about participation in transitioning situations in weak states, especially. So that's one background. This is also based in my own prior work in political economy, where I looked at strategic factors having to do with political survival and determining how governments raise financing in war times. That's another kind of genealogy of my own background. And then more recently, I've looked at the problem of interreligious collective action around issues of liberation, around issues of solidarity for eco-human justice. And the particular project that I recently completed was a look at the work of a German theologian, Hans Künkler, and his interpretation, the interpretation of that by Paul Nitter, a Catholic theologian. And I compared that with Farid Ishaq's work, a progressive Muslim thinker, and made the argument that these proposals, the idea of solidarity for eco-human justice, rest on the assumption that the primary strategic dilemma is one of what we would call in game theory a coordination game or a harmony game. In contrast, I believe that a more appropriate model is the prisoner's dilemma, and incorporating that triggers the need for institutions to deal with issues of trust, to deal with issues of costs and commitments, credible commitments that allow for that sort of collective action to be sustained. So that's some additional pieces of my background. And another aspect of it is the work on my foray into something that is not quite political theory, but it is through the lens of institutional analysis and design, and the idea about whether we can design through managing institutions at different levels in societies a way to have an anti-statist conception of political Islam. And that has been a problem that has taken 2 of my recent projects. So to proceed in more specific detail about some of the individual papers that we saw presented, let me start first with a very big statement that has to do with, obviously, my normative commitment as a Muslim, but I think in some way touches very directly on, I would argue, a major question that Professor Piscatori raised, and an issue that has come up in Andrew's work, although in Andrew March's work in different ways, and that is that how do we fundamentally understand as Muslims what our task is Our task is to emulate the best exemplar that we have, and that is the Prophet. And so how do we do that? One way is to look at, well, what are texts? How did he live his life? What are the authentic sources that we have transmitted? And many of you will be familiar with the structure of textual resources for Islamic law. But I urge you to remember that text alone is actually not what is meant by sunnah usually. Sunnah is something more, and one of the ways to understand it is that even though text can contribute to our understanding of sunnah, you have to have a theory of sunnah, you have to have a fiqh of sunnah. You have to have some approach, and an approach to discerning what that sunnah is. And let me suggest a simple one that will be familiar to many of you in other contexts, but it's that the prophetic role, unlike what you might consider the Constantinian version of Christianity or the priestly or clerical establishment version of some places in Islam, the prophetic role is to speak truth to power. And that role of speaking truth to power is what ultimately creates the animus which decides who is an appropriate authority to follow. Because that was a major question that you raised about how it is that at a normative level, at a micro level, people decide that this is something appropriate for me to follow. I think at a level of discernment, it has to be something that connects them to the idea that they are demonstrating their love and their loyalty to the authentic prophetic sunnah. And if you get lost in the small branches and lose the big picture, I think that this is one key mechanism for interrogating things that would emerge again and again. And I would say that one of the ways you mentioned, Professor Piscatori did, that he has an interest in the many narratives and the stories that people listen to. If you look at the parables, the various stories of different prophets that are there in the Quran, you routinely find pious figures speaking truth to people who don't want to hear it. And in some cases they do hear it, some cases they don't, and there's all sorts of different things that play out. So the question arises that how do we decide who is the appropriate version of the prophetic model today? Of course, who counts as that? And of course, many of you will be familiar with the hadith that says al-ulama warathatul anbiya, that the scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. But who are the scholars? Who counts as scholars? Who has the authority to interpret? And you raised this question, I thought, very well at the end of your presentation, Professor Modirzadeh did. So the two things that I would say here that are particularly important is that the role of conversation, perhaps maybe not in the exact context in which you raised it, but of a different kind, is extremely important because of another tradition that speaks of a great jihad as being speaking the word of truth in front of an oppressive structure that does not want to hear it. And so that I would say is one of the standards that you might look at trying to figure out who is a good model. Is there somebody who seems to be a figure of moral and spiritual conscience first and foremost? Is there a pattern there that can be invested, that can be found and somehow gained or somehow gleaned from the figures that are out there, combined with a reputation for knowledge? I think that is particularly important. What I would add to that, though, that I think is also important, is that simply because you find somebody who's kind of a people's alim, somebody who's speaking out against the government, does not mean that he is that figure of conscience. I would urge you to look at, particularly for those of you who may not be familiar with Habib Ali Jifri's very interesting lecture on the issue of, historically, the tension in the relations between the alim and the hakim, the power authority and the religious scholar. And the fact that the critical duty of the alim, the critical duty of the knowledgeable individual, is to elevate themselves above and beyond the political pressures of their time and the ego pressures that they're under. And that means to elevate themselves so that they do not compromise to bring themselves closer to the authority figures, and they don't compromise to curry favor with the populists of the time or to become a populist figure. And that is, of course, we talk about the domain of the heart, the purification of the heart. That is why it is emphasized time and again, because ultimately the responsibility and the great warning that's posed is for Muslims, this world is a test, and the accountability in the hereafter. The classic report that is there from the Hadith literature says that among the people that will be raised up will be an alim who is questioned about what he did with his knowledge, and he says, well, I studied knowledge for your sake, O God, and it's said to him that, no, you lied, you did it for worldly motives, and he's thrown into the hellfire. And so that's the kind of warning that I think is from a Muslim normative point of view, would be extremely important. Let me move, after that very brief look at Professor Piscatori's comments, to Andrew March's work. And I should say that I'm going a little bit beyond your presentation yesterday, which was extremely helpful to me, because I'm not a political philosopher, and I really appreciated how you made those distinctions. But I'm actually thinking also of your very recent article in the American Political Science Review. So this may be a little bit new to some of the audience who have not encountered that. I've only read it very briefly, but I would say that there are three broad things that I'd be interested in in how you converse on those three issues. The first one is, if you look at, for example, the beginning of Muhammad Qasim Zaman's book called The Ulama in Contemporary Islam, he has a section where he talks about the nature of tradition. And in a very succinct summary of Alistair MacIntyre's work on tradition, Alistair MacIntyre, a Catholic, a Thomist, essentially says that tradition is what tells you what things can be argued about and how to proceed with argument. And so it seems to me that that is talking about something that is alive and dynamic and evolving and can generate new consensus, new trends, new views, and it continues to grow and change. It's not the positions that are picked from various places. I would argue that Ibrahim Musa, in his book Ghazali and the Poetics of Imagination, describes that Ghazali's major contribution to the way we think about life today in a post-Aristotelian, an Einsteinian background of understanding of the world around us is to make the case that you cannot have tradition as a mummified entity. You cannot. It's to move beyond the mummification of tradition, which tends to happen whether you're looking at the traditionalist maximalists or the fundamentalist maximalists or the Salafi maximalists. Maximalism is this idea of people who take their stamp of tradition and apply it to various different contexts. And I'm sorry if I've given you a lot of additional terms, but it struck me that was one thing that it seemed to me that your extremely important and interesting argument, and it was such a pleasure to see something like that in the APSR. And I hope it will be widely read and have a big impact. But what I would say is that second point, it seemed to me that your article tended to fall into that version of things. And while I understand what you're saying about the insider-outsider issue, I don't think that it is a block to engaging with the tradition in this particular way. And I also understand I believe the rationale for why you picked what you thought were the most conservative positions to try to make your case. I think that's one rationale, but it's not the only one. And then the third thing I would say is, and this is a question that's it's somewhat unfair from the point of view of the article, because it's to do with the broader issue of how you place yourself in the world context that we're in. We're obviously in a time of nation building. Is this a time of religion building? Is in some ways your project an exercise in religion building? Is it something that a progressive theologian might critique for being essentially the effort to direct and shape a liberal conception of Islam, which you're showing that without authentically allowing for critical interrogation of the existing injustices that we find, whether they come in the garb of Islamic law or in the garb of American law, or in the garb of separation of religion and state, or in the garb of cooperation. And so that kind of prophetic voice in there at all times, to return to that comment, I think is one thing that I would just, maybe a biographical note or something like that might be very helpful to explain where this is coming from. To turn to let's see. To turn to the work of David Patel, which I thought was not only do you have you're incredibly bold to spend so much time in Iraq this way, but also I thought the research and the communication of it was very, very thorough and very compelling. But I have a couple of comparative or things to think about that are somewhat outside the domain of what you spoke about, but I think would be very interesting for me to hear your reflections on. The first one is, what does your model say, or what might it predict, or how might it explain the variations in intra-Shia conflict? And and is this through alternative mobilization structures? What does it do? Does it just delegitimate the role of the sermon? It seemed to me that you were presuming often not only the uniformity in sermons, but also the authoritativeness. If not, I understand what you meant about, well, it helps you figure out if other people are doing the same thing, that helps you decide. But I thought that was one thing that might help get at some of this question, the intra-Shia conflicts. And then the second thing is I would wonder about actually make that three things. This is part two of the first thing. So part two is that I think about the investiture conflict in the evolution of Latin Christendom, and the period around 1000 when you have the various the issues of the Pope and the anti-popes, the bishops and anti-bishops, and the confusion about what the Gelasian doctrine, how it could be interpreted, and what I would be interested in is you loosely drew this parallel, which you often find elsewhere also, that the Catholics and the Protestants, Sunnis and Shias, which obviously has many problems with it, but in this particular period, is that kind of anointing of figures and rival anointing of figures, what does it have to do? For example, you made this prediction about Muhammad Yaqubi. I would be interested in where the sources of that are. Is it primarily through getting the message out? Is it primarily through a handover of authority? In Muqtada Sadr's case, too, I thought that was very interesting how you addressed that briefly yesterday. But this would be a case I would look at. The third thing, and I'll just say this very briefly, and because it's an idea that I haven't fully formed. But one thing that it seems to me that, well, everybody talks about the possibility of the breakup of Iraq, right? At what point do we start seeing these engagements or these networks as providing state-like functions of extraction, of protection, of welfare, and of mobilizing, allocating, and reallocating resources? And if you do start seeing them rather than, these are groups in society or oppositions or insurgents or something, and you see them instead as embryonic states, as baby states, or as something that are something on the path to a different state formation or secession, how does that change the analysis? That's one thing that I would pose to you. And for the panelists that we heard this morning, let me start with Professor Modirzadeh's extremely interesting and very thoughtful presentation, which I'm very excited to get to know your work better. Actually, I just have a few thoughts that came to mind. Let me start with the position of the ulama, especially the Hanafi ulama, under British Imperial India. And what we see taking place at that time is that the British actually wanted to standardize Hanafi law. And they said, we will rule you. You want to be ruled by your confessional law? That's what we will do. And in fact, some of the books of compilations of Hanafi law are by these British compilers. And so the question is, could they get enough judges to staff their positions to in fact adjudicate that? And there were problems with getting enough. That's a long story about why. But the reason I raise this is that women who were having trouble with their husbands, Muslim women who were having trouble with their husbands, would, instead of seeking divorce, which was a lengthy process that requires a judge to give that pronouncement, they would renounce Islam. And then once you've renounced Islam, you're automatically divorced. So they would renounce Islam, and this was creating a problem. And what we see is the rise of very thoughtful discussions on the part of the ulama of the time, and this was something that I mentioned on my first presentation, eventually leading to probably the most extensive list that you could imagine of grounds on which a woman can unilaterally seek divorce. And this is coming from what is now considered the most conservative school of thought in Hanafi Islam in India, which is Deoband. And one of the most notable scholarly authorities in it, Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi. See, so, and if you look at his work, and if you look at the other works that are along there in the list of those things, it's I would ask about that kind of process, that kind of engagement. Is there some mechanism, perhaps? And I don't mean that you should trigger apostates or something like that. So. And I would. There's just another very quick thing two other very quick things that I don't mean to belabor this, but very quick things that come to mind. One of them is, of course, that if you look at the problems with the hudud ordinances in Pakistan, meaning the ordinances that have led to many cases of women rape victims that have come forward being punished for committing fornication, for committing extramarital sex, and that. Or if not punished, being placed on the dock for that, and their own evidence is used against them. And the way to deal with this, I think, the opinion of the Mufti Taqi Usmani, one of the most famous current Pakistani scholars, is very interesting. He says basically, essentially, two things. Number one, that the standard of due process is essentially so high that it's unprovable. You cannot prove this. What you need is 4 righteous people to see the actual act of penetration and then testify it to it with absolute certainty in a court of law. And righteous people means people of good conduct. So how are you going to find people of good conduct? And then, so there's that problem. But the other thing that he says is essentially that you cannot use the testimony in that previous trial, or the being found in that previous trial, her claim, in the future context, because the burden of proof is on the claimant. This is a key argument that he makes from core values of the Islamic law that are widely accepted. So the other thing I would just say is, I wonder if you have seen Pervez Sharma's new documentary, Al Jihad of Love, on homosexuality in the Muslim world. And I've not seen it, but I've heard a very recent interview with him, which I thought was fascinating. I'm very excited, and I think that might be very relevant for your work. And let me turn to Professor Künkler's presentation. And I would say, first of all, I'm a little puzzled by the Harvard findings that you reported, the Harvard project's findings, because if you are familiar with Daniel Philpott's argument in the... Oh yes, well I would like to hear that conversation, because my understanding is that when Daniel Philpott looked at the third wave of democratization, he explained the Catholic component of it by reference to institutions and ideas, the political theology and the political institutions specific to that context, the Vatican II environment and the system of bishops. And he looks at Islam in comparative context with the relative absence of those two things. So that's something I would be very fascinated to hear that conversation. And then the other thing, this is just a side note, but you say the U.S. receives a 0 on Jonathan Fox's measure. I wonder what the U.S. would have received before the 1940s. Before the 1940s, when you don't have the interpretation of the Disestablishment Clause the way it is interpreted now, how does that change? And that's, I would just be interested in that. And the final thing that I would say is, if you look at the argument made by Vali Nasser in Islamic Leviathan, he argues that among a particular category of states, what he calls the thoroughgoing Islamizers, you have the explicit effort to adopt normative attachments to Islamic doctrine, law, or symbol, and use them to basically expand state reach and capacity. It's a step more than being an opportunistic Islamizer. And I wonder how that works in the context of Senegal and Indonesia in particular, when you have well-organized society groups and the state working with them, obviously. Thank you very much to Middlebury College and to the organizers of the symposium, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity.
All right, we do have some time for questions, and what I would like to do is momentarily actually invite the three of you to come up here, and we'll take the podium down so that you'll each have a mic, and you are welcome to pose questions to any of our speakers. Before I do that, I do just want to remind you that the symposium itself is not over, and that you're welcome to join us for three other events, actually. We do have lunch available for those who are attending the dance performance. So at 12:45 in the Center for the Arts lower lobby, there will be lunch available. Right prior to the 1:30 p.m. dance performance in the Dance Theater in the Center for the Arts by Leah Tawil, with violinist Mike Khoury, who will discuss the avant-garde in Arab dance as well. And then we do have a film screening at 2 times at 3 p.m. With an introduction, and also at 8 p.m. of the film Osama, which is an Afghan film in 2003 that depicts a particular family's challenge in their life under the Taliban. It was made immediately after the Taliban fell, and so it has a very real feel to it, shot on location in Kabul. I encourage you to attend one of those 2 screenings as your time permits. If I can invite the panelists to come up for questions.
Oh, yes.
And we do encourage you, as you ask questions, we do have a microphone that we will give you so that everyone can hear. Do you have the mic? Yep. Okay, there's a question over here on the right.
In the course of human history, we have seen the development of religions which have come and gone. Now, in this day of so-called scientific enlightenment, in which science has developed more knowledge about the material world about us, and in addition, and perhaps more importantly, has developed recently techniques telling us how our brain works, and some of the mysteries of the effect of drugs on our brain. My question is the current rigidity of these religions and their beliefs in the words of prophets of hundreds of years ago, or writings of hundreds of years ago, appropriate to control the actions of the modern world? Is it not time to question whether these are the only solutions that are applicable in view of all this increased knowledge in the behavior of the humans at the present time? Thank you.
It's always hard to answer a question that begins with "in the course of human history," but I think I of course have absolutely no way of answering that question and wouldn't dare to begin. But I would just say that there have been interesting developments, I think, and certainly I think in some of Mirjam's research, particularly on Indonesia and other countries. But I think there have been developments in incorporating, for example, scientific knowledge, modern philosophy, a number of technological sciences, computer science, into the curriculum of a number of Islamic universities and seminaries around the world, and a rich debate going on, I think, within Islam and between theorists and jurists about to what extent this very problem that you pose should have a role in the development of Islam today. So the question, for example, of whether or not there's a debate in Iran on Islamic secularism, and of course I would turn over to the expert to talk about that. But I think this is something that certainly, as you point out, might be a global debate between religions and people that don't ascribe to religions. But I think it's perhaps a positive indicator that it's also a debate within Islam today.
Maybe I can just add just a very little bit to that, which is that I mean, I appreciate the question, and I think it's a valuable starting point. But I would ask you to further examine the premises. First of all, the premise that religion requires an unquestioning approach. I think that normatively religion requires doubt and questioning. This is certainly there found in the major spiritual testimonies of a lot of people, and that the argument that it's rigid is also, I think, one to look at. But I think more importantly, there's this tendency to presume that science is leading towards truth with a capital T. And I'm not sure where that comes from and why it's there. I know that scientists wear robes at graduation, but that's not, they're not the priests, obviously. And that I think scientism is somehow it has soaked our consciousness in our time, and so that's one thing that I would ask you to look at about the look at, for example, the work of Wolfgang Smith on this. I think is a very, very appealing writer in this area.
Other questions?
I have a question directly for Mirjam, but you mentioned the case of Senegal and Indonesia, if I remember correctly, of how states are sponsoring madrasas, and those madrasas are, the curriculum is in a way regulated by the state. It does remind us of some way the 1970s and 80s madrasas that were formed under Zia in Pakistan, and then the question of radicalism and their vulnerability to transnational radicalism, be it from the Gulf states or from Saudi Arabia. Is there any particular mechanism that Senegal and Indonesia are using to guard against those, the influence of transnational radicalism on these state-sponsored madrasas? And if you could just touch on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, the institution of these Islamic universities was an important part of that, because only those madrasas whose curriculum is approved by the state, only graduates of those madrasas are then approved to apply to state Islamic universities. So those religious institutions or schools, including some Pesantren Islamic boarding schools whose curriculum has not been approved by the Ministry of Religion, would generate graduates that can't even apply. So the social mobility is precluded for attendees of those. And it's interesting, there have been opinion polls of how parents make their decisions, of course, of where to send their children to religious schools or state schools, and which kind of religious schools, whether boarding schools or madrasas, and whether the state accredited ones or not. And of course, the idea of social mobility is incredibly important. Still, I think the financial incentive is probably most important in determining, of course, also religious ideas are, but the financial incentive is very important in determining whether parents would send their children to religious or state schools. But then the next step is the idea of how much social mobility is facilitated through that venue. I just want to take the opportunity to clarify this note about Tim Shah and Daniel Philpott. So Tim Shah and Monica Duffy-Toft actually have a book forthcoming that's based on that research program. And Daniel Philpott's research is part of that. It's a little bit different in that he also expands it to look at when are religions more prone to engage in violence, and when is violence dogmatically endorsed. And so he has actually a wider catalog of variables than Tim Shah and Monica Duffy-Toft have. He also looks at demographic circumstances, at levels of religiosity and so on, that they don't pay so much attention to. For the case of the Catholic Church, of course, Vatican II was incredibly important. Nobody, I think, would doubt that. But the point that the research project makes is that religious dogma only starts to matter if there is a legal autonomy for religious institutions that can provide this venue for oppositional activity. If that's not the case, for example, take China. The Catholic Church in China is the only church where China, of course, reserves its right to ordain its own priests, Catholic priests, and its own cardinals. And actually, I think it was 2 or 3 months ago that for the first time within 40 years, a cardinal acceded to the position in agreement with the Vatican. So this is a very new development, but for the longest time, I think religious dogma from the Catholic Church wouldn't matter much in China because the personnel decisions are made by the Chinese government. And I think that's what meant with, or here's why it is important that the legal and financial autonomy comes in. Yeah.
Question here.
My comments for Mirjam. You gave us some wonderful examples of how the state has constructively engaged with religious authorities to promote things that we would consider good. But you didn't mention at all the potential negative consequences of this, and which I think you especially see in the authoritarian countries in the region when the states interfere with religious institutions. Yeah. And I'll just mention two. One is, as traditionally in Islam, clerics had to look to the people for support. They had to look to the people to collect taxes and to basically maintain their legitimacy. And a lot of the work I presented on Iraq, the clerics knew what the people needed at the local level. And they responded to those needs because the community supported them and pays them and maintains them. As the state starts to pay salaries and appoint preachers and train preachers, preachers will start looking to the state. for support, for everything else, and ignore the demands of the community. And this happens in a lot of places. I once listened to a sermon in Jordan about how good traffic patterns is un-Islamic. Don't double park. The Prophet Muhammad said, don't block the market with your stall. And so don't double park. Double parking is un-Islamic. And he was delivering the sermon in a town that had 3 cars. This really wasn't that useful for the people who really needed sermons on how they should have sustainable water extraction from the ground. That's what they really needed. But because the state told him to speak about double parking, he talked about double parking. The second is it opens up space for delegitimization of clerical authorities. And most Islamist groups in the region who are opposed to the regime, the first critique they have is that the existing clergy, the ulama, are pawns of the state. They're reinforcing existing power structure. And if you want to talk about speaking truth to power, any cooperation between clerics and the state puts a giant bullseye on their back. And I was wondering if you think this varies from the democratic regimes you were talking to non-democratic regimes. And at what point, how do states begin to engage constructively with clerics without basically undermining the authorities they have with the people?
No, thank you. These are very good comments. And I think actually, for sure, it matters entirely whether you talk about a democratic or an authoritarian environment, and this idea that religion can only be a pro-democratic force if there is a degree of legal autonomy highlights that, because if there is cooperation on an authoritarian regime, there is this possibility of co-optation and control. We think of the Middle East very often in terms of regulation of minority religions, but the levels are actually higher in the extent to which the majority religion is being regulated, right? And in which Islam is being regulated. Orthodoxies are created and upheld and maintained. And but that just makes me think or creates another argument why, and Iran is a case in point, why for the majority of ulama a democratic transition is in their interest, of course. And we have numbers from Iran that actually only 18% of the religious clergy is affiliated in personnel to the regime. That doesn't mean that 80% are potential opposition, but at least, if you discount maybe 50% are in the quietist camp and not really interested in politics at all. But there is a substantial number of Hujjatul Islam ayatollahs that do have alternative conceptions of what the political community should look like and are precluded from making these arguments in public. And Iran is indeed, in my point of view, perhaps one of the most sophisticated places in terms of legal argument. But again, because of the level of control and because there is no legal sphere in which these alternative arguments can actually translate into concrete social movement politics and trickle down into I think political behaviors into religious behavior that is politically relevant for political change. That's the reason why that discourse stays where in the discursive area it doesn't translate into political activism so far, or hardly does.
Thanks very much. A question for all three. It's a sort of Quinn-like, deceptively simple question. Do Muslims have to believe in human rights and democracy to be democratic? Do they have to internalize the values?
Can I answer that?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, because it sort of relates to this sort of stuff that I was trying to talk about yesterday, but I will defer.
I'd like to hear them do it too.
Yeah.
Go on.
I'd like to actually just have Andrew start.
Okay, so I don't think I need the microphone. So, that's it. Okay, so yes, I don't know if everybody's here, but I spoke about the importance of taking Islamic law or taking doctrine, taking formal religious beliefs seriously, but also formal philosophical beliefs. So the idea is that, of any particular constitutional or social order, this also kind of related to the gentleman's question over there, has a particular public form of justification. We don't only have democratic institutions, we don't only have civil rights, but we also have a common public understanding of why we have them. So for example, in America, we don't have democracy and civil rights because of a formal declaration that we know now in the course of human history that religion is false, and therefore it would be a philosophical error to base government on religion. Rather, we have other kinds of public justifications that are based on either existing social consensus or things like and appeal to reasonableness or cooperation or things like that. So now the objection to the emphasis, well, why do we all have motivations? Why do we care whether anybody has a motivation to support this? Would be an argument from social science, that these things emerge from practice, that people are very, very complicated, and people are very, very good at dealing with ambiguities in their lives, and that people may have certain philosophical, moral, or religious commitments, but that very few people are kinds of doctrinal automatons who first try to get their doctrine straight and then apply that doctrine to action. And in practice, people live in the world, they develop habits, they develop practices, they act within institutions, they respond to incentives and things like that. So, clearly, right, part of the purpose of not having a public philosophy about, that everybody has to agree with relies on this idea that people are able to respond to practices even without having the philosophy or the theology or the law entirely formulated. Now, so why then do we care? Well, we also know that at certain times, and this I think was raised kind of in the last question, there are certain periods where these sorts of things do matter. When you have an authoritarian regime, where you have a long-term regime, where you don't have extreme political activity, you don't have utopian social movements, you don't have constitutional design, we tend to act out roles. We tend to act into practices. We don't every day wake up asking, what does the Constitution allow us? Or why do we have a Constitution that reads the way it does? But there are periods of regime crises, or there are periods where these sorts of things are brought into question, either because of exogenous circumstances or new events, like the culture wars in America are things where we don't have settled questions. And then you have highly articulated, highly motivated elites that are motivated by perhaps a broader gripe with democracy or something like that. So no, Muslims don't have to have a theology of democracy to do anything. We know that Muslims commit zina, Muslims drink, Muslims do all sorts of things without having an Islamic justification for why that's legal. However, when you know that there is an elaborate alternative doctrine of political legitimacy, of justice, of the good, which doesn't necessarily cause any individual's action on Wednesday, but is there to be mobilized and as a resource, and we know from history has an extraordinarily mobilizing potential, that it matters very much that some kind of alternative answer to these kinds of questions exist. If somebody, we're talking about Shiite authority, whatever authority, is able to say from a position of authority at times of regime crisis that we know that this is illegitimate, we have something else, it certainly helps to be able to have an answer to that on those own terms. When at least those kinds of conservative doctrines are being contested, when there's an answer from within that says, well, maybe the range of difference within Islamic thought or Islamic ethics or Islamic law is a lot more complicated than that, that's an extraordinary political resource. And so I think it's more of a question of long-term stability and the long-term sort of ability to achieve social unity on moral grounds rather than just habit, practice, or state coercion.
Panelist reactions to that question?
Well, I'm someone who believes that democratic culture is a result of democratic institutions and practices rather than the other way around. And so, and again, I mean, if you look at some of the debates by religious leaders in post-World War II Europe, it's striking how illiberal and anti-democratic they are. But nevertheless, these are arguments that are not valid today anymore. They're not considered valid anymore. And so it's in the short term, no. The answer would be no. In the long term, of course, yes. But I do think that is empirically a result of democratic practices that these values are being internalized.
Seems to be a xylophone somewhere heralding this question. So I think it is a deceptively simple question. I think it's an extremely difficult question. And I think, if maybe to use two examples that I thought of when you asked the question, I think to the extent that this question seems to be calling on us to say what we believe about these issues, I believe it's possible to take dogma and doctrine seriously and also to think that people are complicated and strategic at various times and various moments, and that people can be very confused about what they believe in, while also being religious and also being lots of other things. So I think the two examples that came to mind, one was, and tying onto your example of the Hanafi scholars under British rule in India, I was in southern Afghanistan, in Kandahar, and speaking with a number of women that were trying to sort of organize and discuss issues of women's rights. And the primary idea that they were pushing at the time in Kandahar was to increase the role of Sharia in determining disputes on family law questions. And the reason was that tribal norms and the tribal doctrines that were being applied primarily to issues of divorce, property distribution, inheritance, were far more discriminating against women and unprivileged men over women than the Islamic law did. And so they were calling for Islamic doctrine. Now, they were Muslims, they were women, they were parts of tribes in the south, they were Pashtun. So they had, and I don't mean to dismiss the question by saying identity is complicated, and so this question is complicated, but I think for them, did they believe in equality in the way that a human rights activist would want them to believe in equality? I don't think so. At the same time, did they have a sense that equality was contested and contestable, and that Islamic law could have a role in somehow raising the level overall of equality in disputes? Yes. And so I think another example I was thinking of was in Egypt. There's been this recent debate over the Queen boat arrests and the issue of homosexual behavior or men having sex with men and being imprisoned, tortured, attacked by the government. And the human rights community there did a very interesting thing. They decided to treat the issue primarily as one of torture and of the behavior of the police in entrapping the individuals that were ultimately convicted, rather than going for the questions of homosexuality within Islam or doctrinal developments. It was a strategic choice. They found that going for the issue of torture would get them better results. And there I thought, again, did it matter that Egyptians, who were the ones who would ultimately be called upon to take a position on this, had a deep-seated belief or transformation of their beliefs about the appropriateness of homosexual behavior and whether or not there should be equal rights for individuals who engage in homosexual behavior in Egypt? I'm not sure. For the purposes of transforming the behavior of the state, to the extent that what we care about ultimately is the behavior of the state in acting upon these people's lives, in that case, I didn't think so. But I think to think about it in terms of short-term, long-term, I think it's extremely difficult. I guess I would want to come down that the answer for me would be no in both cases, that I don't think that there needs to be that belief, but I have to think about it more.
Let me also respond to that in the following way, that I think, like Professor Künkler's approach, I tend to focus more on practice than the kind of the big public order things, although I think that's important at a different level. But I'm thinking particularly of Tocqueville's study Democracy in America, when he argued that the heart of democratic health had to do with the habits of heart and mind among the citizens. And the key thing, it seems to me, is the ability to agree to disagree, to work with people who are from different backgrounds than you in a consistent social, civic framework. And you raised this question earlier also in the issue of the adab of ikhtilaf. And we know this is coming up in all sorts of different ways today, but I would say that the issue is not new to Islam. This issue is not something that is now when we suddenly see democratic waves in the world that is being put. That issue, if you look at the adab of ikhtilaf, has been around from Ghazali, to mention Ghazali again, his study of heresiology. And what is the appropriate range, and the range, the inclusion is more wide than not. The real problem comes with what do you deal with people who engage then in political rebellion and terrorism or hiraba or insurgency or something like that. So I would say that you can find strands of throughout Islamic tradition if you approach the question that way.
Okay, we've got time for two more questions. We'll take one here and then one here. Right here, and the gentleman.
Now, as a Christian, I'm very concerned about the rights and well-being of my brothers and sisters in the faith in the Muslim world. And so I'd love to hear from the panel on the issue of reciprocity as Pope Benedict has put it. If you could elaborate on the rights that Islamic law grants to religious minorities, and what kind of a role these rights play in more theocratic regimes like Iran or Saudi Arabia?
In fact, let's take the final question, and then you can respond to either of the questions.
Thank you. I had actually a comment in response to Professor Piscatori's question. We do have some empirical research from other countries that have undergone democratization, apropos of the question of whether Muslims have to believe in human rights and democracy in order to be Democrat. After all, we've witnessed that wholesale changeover in Eastern Europe, former communist countries, where the challenge was indeed how do you create a democracy without democrats, people who had lived under totalitarian or post-totalitarian regimes. And the answer is, I believe, on the basis of the empirical research that we have, that yes, you can undergo the process of democratization, even if there are significant segments of the society that are nostalgic about the old order, authoritarian order, so long as the political elites embrace the proposition that democracy is the only game in town. So that would be at least suggestive of what it might require in terms of the big picture. And so back to your question.
Yeah. Any final comments from the panelists?
I can just talk about the status of religious minorities in Iran. On the one hand, of course, they do have the political right to vote, for example, for parliamentary representatives, but only within their own religion. So that's sort of ridiculous. As a Christian, you have one representative in parliament. As a Jew, you do. Formally, that, and there are also restrictions in terms of entry into university. So the rights are limited.
Yeah, I guess I would agree and say that Iran in this case may be a more positive example than some of the other countries in the region in terms of the formal political rights of religious minorities, and of course it's often considered one of the main human rights dilemmas is the rights of religious minorities in Muslim majority countries that apply Islamic law in one form or another. I guess I would just say that it's been, I think, a tricky issue for the human rights movement because oftentimes it's perceived as an issue that in the U.S. marshals a much greater degree of interest and financial resources and investment than issues which I think many people consider more serious or affecting more people in the region. So I think it's been a highly polarizing debate within the human rights movement about yes, there are abuses going on. Yes, there are Christian minorities and others that are deprived of their rights in Muslim majority countries in the Middle East, but to what extent do you privilege that as a human rights abuse as opposed to others? I think it's a difficult question.
I think I would just add in a very small form to that it seems to me that this is a question which, much like the situation of the case of the women in southern Afghanistan, that the more successful strategic way to guarantee the protection of the rights of minorities is going to be through appeals to normative Islamic tradition. And there's a wealth of resources there to turn to.
Great. Please join me in thanking our participants.